Good afternoon, and on behalf of Hudson Institute, would like to welcome all of those who have joined us online and in person today for a conversation on US-India and the Defense Compact. This event is part of the Motwani Jadeja US-India Dialogue Series. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Aparna Pande. I'm the director of the Initiative on India and South Asia at Hudson. Founded in 1961 by strategist Herman Kahn, Hudson challenges conventional thinking and seeks to guide policymakers and global leaders in government and business through publications, conferences, briefings, and recommendations. In his testimony last week, the nominee as ambassador to India, Sergio Gore, stated, and I quote, "If confirmed, I will prioritize deepening defense and security cooperation with India. This includes expanding joint military exercises, advancing co-development and co-production in defense systems, and concluding critical defense sales. These efforts will enhance interoperability between our forces while supporting American defense manufacturers and making America more prosperous." End quote. If any of us were asked, especially on the panel, even 15 years ago, which peg of the India-US partnership would be the strongest in 2025, I doubt many would have named the defense element. However, today, the US and India are more strategically aligned in the security realm than ever before. India is a major defense partner. It has signed several foundational agreements. The country with which India holds the largest number of military exercises is the United States. From purchasing almost no arms till 2008, in the last 17 years, India has purchased around $24 billion of defense equipment. Finally, India has always sought to build its defense industrial base, and while for decades that hindered defense sales, in recent years, the US has demonstrated an understanding of India's goal. To discuss the evolution and trajectory of the defense and security partnership, we are privileged to have an all-star panel, I will say, all of whom are very good friends. Anthony Renzulli is an associate partner at DGA Albright Stonebridge Group. He has over 2 decades of experience as a Foreign Service officer. Till recently, he served as Director for India at the National Security Council, and prior to that, Acting Director for India at Department of State. Vikram Singh is Senior Advisor, Defense and Aerospace at the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. From 2012 to 14, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia. Vikram also chaired the DoD Missile Technology Working Group for the next steps in the strategic partnership with India. Samir Lalwani is a non-resident fellow at German Marshall Fund and at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. His research interests include nuclear deterrence, alliances, crisis behavior, and Indo-Pacific security. Ingrid Hennig is Vice President at the Cohen Group and head of the firm's India practice. She has a deep understanding of the Indian market to help build and execute market entry and expansion, advocacy, and government relations for major corporations. I'll request each of the panelists to offer their opening remarks, maybe 5 minutes, and then we'll move into a conversation. Anthony, first.
Thanks, Aparna. Great to see a good turnout on a rainy afternoon and to be with Vikram, Samir, and Ingrid, all good friends, to talk about the US-India Defense Partnership. Aparna, you asked me to comment on the civilian USG side and state NSC and how they viewed the US-India partnership and what some of the challenges were. I think it's useful, well, at least before getting started, underlying imperatives were largely unchanged during my times in service. But I don't wish to extrapolate in terms of looking backwards and as to how the current administration is viewing the defense partnership or what can be expected. Obviously, they haven't fully articulated yet their vision for an Indo-Pacific strategy and where India might fit into that strategy. So there are questions about that. But certainly, my experience had been a consistent upward trajectory in the defense partnership across my 20 years of service. And I think it's useful to quickly reprise sort of the evolving modern strategic partnership, which really kicked in, of course, with the civil nuclear deal. Non-proliferation, the NSG exception, accession to the non-proliferation regimes. This was sort of the framework for the early phases of the US-India strategic partnership. Over time, we think all agree, those of us who had worked on it, that we needed a more expansive framework for advancing this partnership, and we got more ambitious around defense. The focus on defense sales, which included offsets that presaged much of what became known as Make in India under Modi, defense industrial cooperation, and its potential really took off with the C-130 coming into service in 2011, agreements on tail and wing assembly in India, and the C-17 in 2013, many other examples. In my own assessment, defense cooperation, including DTTI and the declaration of India as a major defense partner in 2016, were efforts to leverage the defense cooperation to propel the U.S.-India partnership across a broader set of domains than merely defense. More recently, under the Biden administration, technology became the defining framework for the strategic partnership. The ISET was broad enough to incorporate defense within the strategic technology cooperation framing under that umbrella, and the NSA and the President's, Jake Sullivan and President Biden's clear support for the initiative propelled defense cooperation further, including significant technology transfer agreements and defense sales, including the sale of advanced UAVs. So for the civilian side, what was the imperative? Conventionally, and as it was articulated in the last administration's India strategy, which it had one, and it was an internal elaboration of the Indo-Pacific, forward-facing, public-facing Indo-Pacific strategy of the last administration. It was in the U.S. interest that India be able to deter aggressive behavior along its border and in the Indian Ocean region. We wanted, and we should still want, a capable partner in the region. So how do you best assure alignment, if not alliance, with India over the long term? Defense cooperation is not the only means, but it's an essential means to ensuring this outcome. It's the job ultimately of diplomats, and this includes civilian colleagues at defense, to enable a deeper and a wider framework for defense partnership everywhere you can. Strategic technology was the Biden focus, but there was full support for expanding the defense partnership across nearly all domains. I can think of few instances where we ever hesitated to approve a joint exercise, a dialogue, or the signing of a new foundational agreement, regardless of any occasional frictions that might have manifested on the outside. A former boss, well known to all of us, used to joke, the U.S.-India partnership is like a shark. It goes forward or it sinks into the sand. You're always trying to identify and open up new opportunities for progress, to try to realize the ambitious vision, often out of reach, that the leaders set, and to realize that vision. So what were the challenges? Well, where do you start? And most important, from my perspective, there were certain baked-in limitations on defense technology transfer to India. These needed a very systematic and sometimes assertive approach to overcome. The State Department, and I recognize Sean Hayslip in the audience, so this is strictly a personal interpretation, but I did think sometimes the State Department's implementation of the Hyde Amendment effectively designated sort of delivery systems as a means of enabling India's nuclear weapons system. That might not have mattered for a C-130, but it certainly mattered for UAVs and a lot of advanced technology. The security of U.S. technology, vagaries of the FMS system, of course, were well known. The security of U.S. technology, given cyber risks and the volume of Russian equipment in the Indian arsenal, were and surely remain challenges, especially in the undersea domain and in missile technology cooperation. And so, to the extent practical, you try to deal with these systematically, but also one-on-one as they arise. For example, the S-400 waiver. In my own experience, the real takeaway we never issued the waiver, but the waiver was effectively approved. The real takeaway was that we were able, as a government, harnessing the expertise of our technical experts and working closely with Indian counterparts to reach a level of assurance on the security of our technology, while the diplomats, of course, helped to reinforce the importance of continuing the downward trajectory in the purchase of new and advanced Russian material. It was a great team effort and surprisingly collaborative effort as well with our Indian partners. More systematically, export control reform undertaken by the first Trump administration and the extension of strategic trade authorization to India moved substantial volumes of defense technology to the Commerce Control List and enabled the strategic tech partnership that the Biden administration grew. These were reformed U.S. interpretation of UAVs under the MTCR, ultimately led, of course, to the lease and then the sale of of 31 MQ-9 drones. These were commerce and state-led initiatives undertaken with strong White House direction. It was a team effort. The purported need for strategic balance with Pakistan was a real problem at times, and maybe again, sales of, recently as the Obama administration, sales of Javelin, Patriots were impeded over concerns over strategic balance. Now we're trying to make these Javelins, for example, in India. Will these concerns arise again? I don't necessarily think so, but I think Pakistan has entered the mix again in the current framework, and maybe we could talk about that. There's also been the relative incongruence between our systems. That's a challenge as well. The Ministry of Defense in India has somewhat different authority than our Pentagon. Indian MEA, of course, had very direct authority that needed perhaps to be shared more fully within our system with the Department of State. Seeing a heightened role for the NSCS in India, I think, did help the coordination process on their side. It certainly helped in ours, and the 2+2, I think, was an effective mechanism. I observed sort of a greater effort on the Indian side at interagency collaboration, which I think delivered results, not just for defense, but also in space. To wrap up, and sorry if I ran a minute long, I mean, as a personal recollection, I remember the June 23, negotiating the June 23 joint statement with Indian counterparts and for the Modi state visit. And at the time, we tried for what we were wanting to define as a defense partnership of first resort. No go, didn't get that. But we did achieve an affirmation of a comprehensive defense partnership in which our militaries coordinate closely across all domains: mutual logistics support, streamlined implementation of foundational agreements, information sharing, joint service cooperation, emerging defense domain dialogues, joint exercises, maintenance and repair agreements, and yes, accelerated defense industrial cooperation. These are all vital efforts, and it was imperative for the governments and the full breadth of civilian and military country teams to keep this big, broad agenda moving forward. So it takes creativity, adaptability, leadership, coordination, and most of all, trust to advance this partnership, and it can't be nurtured in a bubble. The commercial, scientific, diplomatic, and people-to-people components of the partnership all matter to a healthy defense partnership.
Thank you, Anthony. And what you said sort of, very easily dovetails into what I'd like Vikram to focus on. Mr. Singh.
Very easily dovetails and steals a lot of my thunder. So, but the beauty of that is it gives me an opportunity to pivot. And I'll do a little bit of, I think that gives you the macro rationale and a lot of the challenges with a good amount of granularity. But why did, from just the defense and military standpoint, why did we start to pursue, and rather assertively, this kind of partnership with India? And I think, again, to echo Anthony, going back to 2005, just from the vantage point of DoD and the armed services. So I think one way I like to think of this military-to-military relationship is that for the U.S. military, India and defense cooperation with India has always been sort of a major opportunity that feels like it's somewhat unfulfilled or not meeting its potential. India could be the security provider throughout the Indian Ocean region. India can complicate calculations for China as it thinks about misadventures it might have on its eastern flank. India makes it have to worry about its western flank. India, if you go back to the earlier phases of mil-to-mil cooperation, India, with its historic dependence on Russia, was sort of a prize to pull away from the Russian orbit in terms of its sort of strategic tilt, which is seen as beneficial to the United States in many ways in the security sphere. And India if we had a mil-to-mil partnership with India, from even 20 years ago, there was a view that was good for our military relationships in Southeast Asia or with African nations or in all these other places where India and the Indian military, had built up a fair amount of trust over decades, including through things like its participation in peacekeeping operations. And it's generally, the view that nobody's worried if the Indian military shows up, right? I mean, whether it's humanitarian assistance, disaster response, those sorts of things. So the U.S. military was like, we should have a much better relationship with the Indian military. So we were eager to get exercises going. We were eager to have defense sales, obviously, for obvious reasons, a large market that was closed off to us, and with China, not a market. Going back to Tiananmen, the Indian market was a big opportunity, and so on the defense side, it was just a matter of the civilian and political leadership saying we want to try to do something big with India. That got all of DoD thinking, what more could we do with India? And if you look historically outside of the technology control space, the enthusiasm for the partnership with India in civilian and uniformed folks at the Department of Defense, now the Department of War, don't let me get that wrong, was always high. There's always a high degree of enthusiasm. So, but from the Indian side, I think that military relationship was a little more complicated, because it was an opportunity for best-in-class exercises, for better technology, for professionalization, and for more effective capabilities. But it was always viewed as sort of a risky proposition. A risky proposition for many reasons that on the US side, we don't necessarily empathize with. So from the Indian side, there's the reliability issue, which is now at the fore again. But are we a reliable partner, or will we cut you off? And of course, that stems most immediately from sanctions after the nuclear tests. With the United States, we felt that, hey, our complete 180 on that, from we're sanctioning you, we're sorry, we don't want to, but it's our law, so we're sanctioning you for these nuclear tests, to we are going to fight to get India a seat at the nuclear high table and get all the rules of the non-proliferation treaty and global frameworks for nuclear non-proliferation. We're going to bend them all for India. We saw that as a sign of incredible commitment that should absolutely assuage any Indian concerns. I mean, why are you worried about the United States when it's the only country in the world that would say, no, let's make a special carve out just for India to get to be in the nuclear club? And that continues to this day. We're still pushing for India to get the last of the four, get membership in the last of the four nuclear governing mechanisms, the nuclear suppliers group. And so this is like, big deal on our end. From the Indian side, it's always a worry. Will they shut off supplies? Will we get sanctioned in some way? Will we get, and I think, today tariffs have become sort of a proxy for being sanctioned in some way. And the fear and the worries of that have all come back up. The obstacles were always much more mechanics, right? We would want to sell things, but we couldn't. They would want to purchase things, and we would say, we can't share that technology with you. And we had sort of ups and downs over the years. I'm giving a sort of a 20-year perspective, but defense trade really started in 2008. So through today, we're maybe at a $25 billion since then. It's not bad, but it's ultimately, 2, 3, 4% of bilateral trade at current levels, pre-tariff levels. So it's not on an annual basis like a monetary thing that makes a lot of impact, but it is a symbolic element of the partnership that was deeply important. The things that have been the most successful have been like the deepening and enhancing of the exercises and the interoperability. Our militaries work extremely well together. And now we have this tactical comfort and tactical confidence that for most of the last 25 years has been sort of met by a top-level political openness, which has grown from sort of let's test the waters as we went and got the civil nuclear deal done and started the first iteration of a defense partnership, to a very trusting relationship that even when you have problems, even as severe as you're seeing now, lines of communication have not broken down. The two sides continue to talk to each other. We don't have any dramatic freezing out. So as that has gone on, we've ended up now with a lot of enthusiasm among the warfighters for the partnership, a lot of enthusiasm among the political leadership for the partnership, for the most part. Recent trade events and spats with Pakistan, which we can talk about notwithstanding. But I think the middle, the system, as Anthony alluded to, has remained fairly hidebound and fairly sclerotic. And the fact is, for India, it's easier to go get stuff from the French or the Israelis or the Russians still. For us, it's easier to partner with NATO allies and partners. And it's also generally more profitable. So there's that middle, the bureaucratic, the systems not working well together. It's really only been addressed when you had heavy-handed top-down pressure. Basically, you've had the White House, Anthony said it nicely, but you had the White House just banging on everybody to get things like the GE jet engine deal and the MQ-9 deals and other things through. And on the Indian side, you similarly have to basically have the political leadership say, no, we're going with this system. We're going to do this through foreign military sales. We're going to make that acquisition that way. And that is different than with other partnerships. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. That goes into what Dr. Lalwani is to speak on the tech side. Samir, over to you.
Thanks, Aparna, and thanks for hosting this. I guess the question I was sort of set to address was like why and how and why has the technology, and specifically the defense and deep technology partnership, grown over time? And I think if you look at the joint statement in February between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi, they set a really high bar and a really ambitious agenda. But it was building off of a lot of successes over the last 8 years under the first Trump administration or the Biden administration. So I think there's been a tremendous growth in the quality and density of deep technology partnerships and ties, whether it's capital, startups, R&D, investments. There's significant sort of figures that show the growth, but let me just sort of speak for a minute onto the why of it, because I think that will reveal a little bit more as to what's the how and sort of the drivers behind it. So the first sort of obvious reason is, starting in 2017, we have sort of a confluence of two things. The Trump administration declares we're in an era of great power competition, which immediately makes India sort of a favored partner, both in sort of public and private strategy documents. And simultaneously, India has sort of one of its many face-offs with China in Doklam, right? And so thanks a lot, China. They've really helped us out in this relationship. But that, I think, became sort of this motivation for the United States to start to seek out partners like India who are capable of burden sharing, both in terms of production, but also in terms of deterrence operations. So it was, I think, early days, but you saw that starting to take off and then accelerate in the Biden administration. The second was India has done a lot of things right. Oftentimes I feel like we don't give India enough credit for some of the internal changes they made. So the first, I think, is it's just a tremendous sea change in how India has dealt with the private sector, particularly in the deep technology and defense space, right? There's a significant opening up that's taken place over the last 10 years. In space alone, there's just this sea change from ISRO being the primary driver, not only of R&D, but commercialization, to creating sort of independent commercialization arm, taking it away from the public sector of ISRO, even though ISRO has a sort of a successful track record, and then encouraging the private sector to come in, and the government putting up money for investments, for capital, for R&D, and that's why you see this tremendous growth of Indian space startups in launch, in satellites, propulsion, different forms of sensing, radar systems, and I think that's to the benefit of a lot of countries like the United States and other Western powers are going to benefit and partner a lot with the Indian space ecosystem. You saw this happen in the defense space as well, with India sort of creating a parallel track for defense innovation through IDEX, which was essentially kind of creating an opportunity for defense startups to enter that space. It's only about 7 or 8 years old and it's also been very successful. A lot of the systems that were employed during the May India-Pakistan war are coming from a lot of these defense startups. So it was important for the Indian government to brush back a little bit or break the monopoly of the public sector domain and open up space for the private sector. And the reason it's not only good for India just on its own, but it enables more opportunity and touch points for U.S. industry. Because at the end of the day, the U.S. government doesn't drive defense cooperation on its own. It certainly doesn't drive defense technology cooperation on its own. It really relies on the private sector and defense industry. And now there's an opening on the Indian private sector space for there to be independent collaborations, without sort of government driving that process. I think sort of simultaneous with the opening up of the private sector, the Indian government put money up, which was significant, right? There's a lot of times where India would have these sort of production-linked incentives where they would say, produce something first and then we'll pay you for it, but we may not because we may not like it. Then they started to put some real capital up front for semiconductors, for space. You see that happening in IDEX, and you see it scaling, right, from small type grants to going up to the million to 3 million, and I think expect to sort of see continued growth of that. And today, actually, India has an emergency procurement program in place, which is I estimate about $4.5 billion. And that doesn't sound like a lot in US dollars compared to our defense budget, but India has an $80 billion defense budget. So already we're starting at 5% plus up. And then when you think about what India actually spends on capital expenditures for new acquisitions, I think it's about 20 billion. So we really have sort of jumped 25% in the Indian defense budget this year for capital expenditures on technology and innovation. $1+ billion of that is for drone technology alone. So money is coming in, and that is helping to stoke the pipeline of the defense sector in India, private and public, and creating openings for U.S. industry and U.S. partners. And Indian companies are now starting to invest in the United States. Indian startups are opening up offices and hiring employees and developing technologies here in the U.S. So it's a virtuous cycle between the two. But the last driver, I think, was it's been mentioned. I want to sort of give it another foot stomp, which is the U.S. government, I think, for the last 9 years has been extremely persistent and hardworking, and it's not just sort of at the leader level, although that's important, that gives the top cover. It's at the working level for technology release, and I think Lisa Curtis deserves a lot of credit, the first Trump administration, for doing that and seizing those opportunities in 2020 during the Galwan crisis. Then the next administration for launching INDOSEX and ISET, and obviously Anthony was a part of that. Lindsay Ford, Tarun Chhabra, seeking out Indian companies and technology and trying to sign them to cooperative research and development agreements, getting them in the pipeline for foreign comparative testing programs, bringing them into accelerator programs, whether in the private or public sector. The State Department sort of changing its approach to technology release. So Sean Hayslip is sort of a part of that team. Indo-PACOM starting to incorporate exercises intermixed with new technology experimentation and testing. And so David Rands was helping Indo-PACOM sort of open doors for that. So I think the problem we find on the U.S. side with sort of Indian government is not a lack of talent or desire or skill, but there is a throughput problem that we consistently find. And the reason we were able to have all these successes over the last 8-9 years is, I think, frankly, the persistence of a lot of hardworking U.S. government officials who continue to do that work today.
Thanks, Samir. And that, again, I think, dovetails into what I'd like Ingrid to focus on, which is the corporate sector. And how does that look at this relationship, the defense relationship?
Thanks, Aparna. There are lots of parallel tracks here, and we all kind of live different parts of this story. And on the corporate side, I take it back to the nuclear sanctions as well, in the sense that when the Bush administration lifted the sanctions in 2001, U.S. defense companies were teed up to go. I, at the time, was working with the U.S.-India Business Council, and at that time, we brought one of the first ever U.S. defense missions to India for Def Expo. We were like sacrificial lambs, basically it was just a very much this historical mistrust. We weren't aligned strategically at that time. And so business was really at the forefront in terms of trying to break down some of those barriers that existed in the relationship. And it was, this was very a fresh experience. The 1998 sanctions cut off supply chains to key programs. And so when we were in rooms, it was very often officials who would lecture the American companies, and that there were, I don't think anyone would have predicted, Aparna, to your point, that we would be where we are today. And so at that time, I would say there were numerous U.S. companies that were thinking about the market. And so you had these large delegations that were going in to meet with the government at that time. But 2002 was an interesting year also, because that is when the private sector was allowed into the defense space. And so early on, the challenges that U.S. companies had working with public sector undertakings, they recognized that partnerships with private sector firms, provided that the government, in fact, would work with them and not just in name designate them such, that started to take off in a really important way. But there were certain companies that are now they're not active in the Indian market because they made a decision that India's quest for indigenization, that they weren't prepared to transfer technology. They weren't prepared to set up joint ventures, and they were looking for that old buyer-seller relationship that had existed in the early years. And so today, you see some very successful joint ventures in India, and it really has created entire ecosystems. Outside of Hyderabad, there is now a defense area where it had literally been dirt land, and within 9 months, the Tata Group stood up the C-130J facility and the Sikorsky cabin facility. And now you have numerous small, medium-sized companies that are in this ecosystem. And it's really exciting to see that, because it really has happened in a short period of time. But just to kind of dial it back for a moment, I mean, it's kind of what were the conditions that allowed U.S. business to move forward. I think each of the speakers has spoken to it. I mean, the foundational agreements were a big piece of this as well, and that goes back to Vikram's time as well, just in terms of the U.S. government taking steps that really did treat India uniquely, but it created the opportunity and, again, the environment for U.S. companies to really be successful in the market. We have clients today through these partnerships that will tell you that they're seeing double-digit cost savings, that the quality hasn't been sacrificed, and these Indian partners are now part of global supply chains. India's largest defense exports were to the U.S. That may not be politically palatable today, but regardless, it really demonstrates that in this short period of time where India has moved up that learning curve, today exports to close to 85 different countries. The innovation is taking off, and if you haven't seen, there's a new defense procurement guideline that came out just this week, which is really now pushing more towards innovation, support to the private sector, support to MSMEs. And so, again, I think that's going to present some enormous opportunities further. Now, the Prime Minister Modi, they've always talked about indigenizing the defense sector. We have seen, again, for U.S. companies to operate in that environment, they have to be willing to look at solutions that, again, fill that need. In the case of some of the companies that are operating in joint venture arrangements, they have the challenge that they face, which I know, Aparna, you've been asking about, is that, I lost my train of thought for a moment. Some of the challenges that they've been facing are the fact that even though they may have 75, 100% FDI in the market, that they're not treated as an indigenous player. And so that is one of the issues. The other is that there's a very high indigenous content requirement on certain procurements, upwards of 50%. And there too, if India doesn't have the capability in certain areas, it's very difficult to get to that 50% level. And so that is a second area that is a serious challenge. The third one is just the import of things like superalloys and metals that are essential to aerospace construction, defense equipment production. Right now, the environment is such that occasionally there are either high tariffs, there's a lack of domestic capacity that exists. And so U.S. industry is really trying to work hand in hand with Indian industry to bring on those capabilities, to bring some of their suppliers that they work with globally into the Indian market. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. So I'd like, I'm going to shoot a few questions to each of you, but feel free to hop in if you would like to also add on in response. My first question is to Anthony. Mentioned this in your remarks, and actually so did Vikram. There's a Russia factor when it comes to US-India relations, defense, and there's a Pakistan factor. And both have have always been there in the background, maybe less in the last 25 years, but they've always been there. Now they are back, they are front and center. So as somebody who's worked in the US government for a long time, how do you see sort of these two factors, the Russia and Pakistan factor, playing sort of, impeding or constraining the development of this relationship in the coming, and I'd like to say the next few years, but you can choose the next few months if you think that's a preferable time frame. I'll leave it to you.
So do you mean the defense relationship? In particular?
Defense right now. Yeah, defense.
Maybe I'll just give a sort of a top-line answer from a State Department Foreign Service perspective. Maybe Vikram or others can talk a little bit further about the sort of mechanical challenges that, for example, the Russia-India defense relationship poses. I don't think I had fully grasped it until I got a little deeper into work to advance the defense partnership, to understand that this wasn't strictly the State Department or any particular bureau. I mean, these were widespread concerns about the integrity and the security of U.S. technology, and they were real, and they couldn't just be wished away by aspirations. And so, particularly in certain domains, I mentioned the undersea domain as being a particular challenge. I think these were overcomable when it came to, for example, jet engines. One of the other crown jewels, I think we could manage that, part because India was already sort of getting out of the use of Russian technology in that space, much more behind when it came to subs, for example, and then hypersonic, supersonic, clearly still a challenge. And as a result, we're not as deeply partnered with India in those areas, although co-development, I think, offers a lot of opportunity. It's a way to go around it. But again, what I also was, my real takeaway, again, from the S-400 experience, which did cause quite a heavy, and again, just could say, interagency, there was a lot of discussion, and of course, with the Hill, over that and how, in the context of the CATSA law that had been passed. But what I really took away from it was that you can manage these problems. You need to have a certain amount of goodwill and a high level of cooperation and some flexibility on both sides. I do think that the Indians did come to understand where we were coming from, and then we sort of were able to meet them halfway. They may not have articulated their intent to reduce the Russian purchases, but no purchases of advanced Russian equipment were seen. I don't think you really count any since then. And so I think that was quite a good outcome for both of our sides, and it built a level of trust that we were able to then carry forward into the engine deal, the 414 engine deal. Pakistan, again, I have the experience. I was a junior officer in my first tour in India when this nuke deal was adopted. So, I could say I sort of spent 20 years working on this account and seen some changes. It is interesting. I can recall when the Pakistan issue was a real problem. David and others might remember it too. Whether or not the president is going to stop in Islamabad on the way to Delhi. For how long? How many hours? These were real discussions and debates. The outcomes weren't always satisfactory at the time, but as you can see, we got to a place where we took the hyphen out of Indo-Pac. And we're obviously in a much different place when we're appealing for the sale of Patriots or proposing co-production of Javelin, very technologies that we were reluctant to sell in the past. I don't know how for me personally, I think rehyphenation seems impractical. At the same time, though, I do have an appreciation, having also worked on Pakistan and served in Pakistan, for the depth of this challenge. And it is ultimately based on trust. I think what the last administration tried to do was insert a trust into the comprehensive and strategic partnership. It's a mouthful, but trust was important. And it does need to be sustained. It certainly doesn't mean the U.S. Needs to turn away from Pakistan, which is a very important country. But I think it needs to be done in a transparent way as much as possible and in a predictable way. I don't know if we're quite there at the moment, but undoubtedly I think it would have a bearing on, trust will have a bearing on the defense partnership moving forward.
Vikram, would you like to comment on that?
I don't think I have much to add to what Anthony said. I do think that it's, there's sort of the conventional strategic analyst, position here, which is that obviously the Indian partnership with Russia is troubling, but that multiple administrations have understood its historical basis, the continued dependencies for strategic systems, and figured out like we have to address it, and therefore we are sensitive to things like not landing in Islamabad on the way to India, and the dehyphenation was much more style than substance. I think I don't know that it was really hyphenated, but being sensitive to Indian concerns. But then there's the sort of reality that in the Trump administration, I don't think President Trump cares about those sorts of niceties, and I don't think that's for a hostile reason. I think he still very much believes in the U.S.-India partnership. He clearly has, I don't think, ever said anything critical about Prime Minister Modi at all. But one of the things he doesn't do is follow shibboleths of policy, and this is the way we've always done it, and that's true sort of across the board. And so, in that world, I think there's a risk of reading too much into a given moment of crisis. I think a moment of crisis can easily flip to a moment of opportunity. I've seen no indication from across the Department of Defense or state or others that there's a turning away from compact trust, which they named trust, all the things in the joint statements, and Ambassador nominee Sergio Gore's testimony was, very on point across the board, very reassuring, and emphasized all the right things, and he would be the closest to a president ambassador we've possibly ever had for India. So, which if you use that as one of your metrics for, there's experience and diplomacy in it, but then there's closeness to the president. And in fact, the way he described that extra role of being a special envoy seemed designed to kind of also assuage Indian concerns, which is that I'm a conduit to the president that regional neighbors can rely on if something important is happening. But I do think strategically, just in a more traditional analytic sense, there has been a sense in the U.S. among U.S. leaders that like you can leave India as the net security provider in the region is something that has been said for multiple administrations. And I think you go back in recent years and the domestic turmoil in Sri Lanka, followed by Bangladesh, followed now by Nepal, I think has really left a sense of, wait a minute, maybe it seems like India has been as surprised as we've been in all of these cases. And I think that does change strategically how folks are going to think about how much should we sort of just say, hey, India, tell us how we should think about this neighborhood versus what we used to do before, which was say, we have a view and you have a view and let's partner. And I think on balance, our interests are aligned, so let's work together. But for example, you go back to like long ago, the Nepal earthquake, and the Indians were very concerned about us providing humanitarian assistance and and really wanted to root it through us. And I think over time, we've deferred more to India in that sense from the US side. And I think the last few years are making people question that a little bit. So I think there's something there, and I think you see echoes of that when it comes to how do we think about Pakistan. Dehyphenation, but was that suborning US-Pakistan to Indian preferences, right? And I think you are seeing some shift.
Can I say one thing? Just on the narrower sort of question of like the India-Russia relationship or the China or the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, I do think that there's probably a way to get at our mutual concerns when it comes to technology leakage, espionage, or cyber backdoors, right? And we have a sort of a parallel concern with each other's respective partner, and it all sort of like hinges on China. So I do think to some degree there could be, and we had sort of in a Track 2 report some years ago had proposed an idea of like some sort of joint intelligence assessment process or center where we could have an analytic exchange on the nature of the China-Russia relationship, specifically the defense technical and technology sharing relationship, and what that exposes its partners to, and simultaneously have one about the China-Pakistan defense technology relationship and sort of what prospects for leakage, not just of technology, but also of technique. So like exercises that Pakistan engages that can then transmit know-how and operational capability to China. Those are things that sort of I think where we agree that we don't want China to have this capacity, and then we can sort of to collectively assess like what's contributing to that and how we can collectively deny it.
Ingrid, do you want to come in or? Okay.
No, I mean, the only thing I would say is Operation Sindoor was a great example where India was up against Chinese technology. And the Indian, the assessment afterwards is that indigenous solutions comprised a lot of their response. And I think it's something that India rightly is very proud of. And I guess one last point I would make is on just the Russia piece. Most Indian private sector companies are not inclined to work with Russian defense companies, so that's something that also works to the advantage of U.S. firms.
Since some of you mentioned the tech and all the sort of trust, compact, Asia, I guess the question is more to Samir, but I'd welcome all of your thoughts on it. India has long sought access to high-end American defense equipment, pushed for co-production, co-development. We had these initiatives, DTTI, ISET, Defense Industrial Roadmap, Compact, Asia, Trust. Are these simply changes in nomenclature a cover-up for lack of substantial progress, or do they signify substantial progress? I'd like your takes on it.
So I'm sure my colleagues have lots of things to say about this. I'll just say, frankly, no. I think that there's a lot of progress that's come out from DTTI. I was literally, in a meeting with a two-star Army officer in India last week who said, look, the Joint Carrier Working Group of DTTI is still going. It's still really helpful to us because even if we haven't bought technologies from each other, or it hasn't led to sort of a co-production deal, it's led to information exchange that is incredibly valuable to both countries' ability for carrier warfare operations. So I think no on face, no because you learn both through failure, but also sort of what the next iteration is, right? I don't think Indus-X was DTTI 2.0, but I think it wouldn't have come about if we hadn't tried DTTI. And so I think there's sort of progress that was made. I mean, today, though, what I see is, you have things like Indus-X, ISET, Trust, and these are market signals where there is big public efforts in a GE engine deal. But then you have a lot of self-initiation in the private sector. So you have self-initiated co-production deals that Shield AI signed with JSW, with AM General signed with Kalyani. These are signals of encouragement and obviously sort of an export licensing process that is favorable. But then these companies are going out on their own and they're finding private sector partners to work on this. You have accelerators that are forming without, again, government backing. An Indian venture capital firm, IndusBridge Ventures, is partnering with a U.S. company, FedTech, to bring Indian companies through an accelerator process to market in the United States, again, to sort of get into the U.S. supply chains and do business here. You have a joint investment fund that was the concept of Indus-X, and even though we couldn't quite get it together through the government process, 8 Indian and U.S. VCs have collaborated together and made an announcement a couple weeks ago that they're going to have a $1 billion capital alliance for Indian deep tech and defense tech investment. You don't have mentor-protege programs like we had hoped for in the Indus-X sort of like initial documents, but you do have a bunch of industrial teaming coming through the private sector, Skydio and AeroArc, Ocean Aero and Anadrone, L3 Harris and Bharat Forge. So it's happening, again, through the private sector, I think because of those sort of government market signals and some effort, but it doesn't exclusively depend on just those formal programs.
Does anybody else want to come in?
No, I would just say it's actually been quite fast. I mean, if you think about it, just 10 years ago, this wasn't really even real in India. It was just moving towards sort of, the Tatas and Mahindras and other non-public sector undertakings, Indian private, corporate, big guys being able to actually play in the space. The change from then to now, where you see hundreds and hundreds of defense and national security technology-focused startups in India, and they're partnering with U.S. firms or big Indian firms or other countries. I mean, that's a very robust ecosystem that's already been sort of booming in a relatively short order. So I think, again, when anything in startup land, 90% failure is not bad, right? There'll be a lot that don't make it, but it's in a very different place. And the attitude, the Indian government's approach to this is all about how do we encourage it, how do we enable it, how do we make it more dynamic.
So I know I am 20 minutes left, so I'm going to ask the audience members, please raise your hand and wait for someone to bring you a mic. State your name, affiliation, and then ask your question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Jake and Sarah. Question to really anybody on the panel is, if you were in a position to advise President Trump on how to get India back on TikTok with 1 billion plus people, given that TikTok is now going to be owned by effectively American interests in an 80-20 deal, do you recommend that President Trump pursue that in order to bring India back on? And what are the implications then for India domestically and otherwise, if they did that?
Does anybody want to? I mean, Jay, it's not really a defense security question.
Kind of a national security issue. I'm happy to opine,
Whoever wants to.
but I don't have any expertise. Maybe Anthony has expertise. I never downloaded TikTok, I have to admit. I'm sorry to my children. But the interesting thing there is, of course, that India banned TikTok in a much more robust fashion. The United States never managed to actually ban it. We just waived the ban for a long time. But in banning it, India gave us the world an example of what happens when it was the most used app and probably the most monetized app in India, right? I mean, people were making their livelihoods off TikTok when it was banned, and Ingrid might have something to say on that. But the fact is, mostly American companies then benefited from that, right? So it's YouTube and Instagram picked up. There have been a few Indian social media platforms in India, Twitter equivalents in India that have tried, but for the most part, the big guys picked up the slack and became where these content creators had to go. And I think if there's an American TikTok, I don't expect to see India being like, we want to let now an American TikTok in. We've already got 2 American companies dominating that space in India. And if anything, they're going to be worried more about overall localization and sort of the lingering, like TikTok still feels like it's Chinese and there's some Chinese ownership, and what's the control and what's the, is our data really secure? I think that would be a hard bar. Now, do the new owners of TikTok America, whatever it becomes, encourage the president to make that a thing, and they want to put out TikTok videos when a Quad Summit happens? I don't know, but I suspect it would be a difficult sell to the Indians.
I mean, just one observation. We worked in the last administration hard to build convergence of interest with India on China. The Biden administration pursued outbound controls, export controls on China, which India struggled to implement. They didn't really have the mechanisms in place, nor did they really have the exports to make that make sense. But they pursued inbound controls that we weren't ready to do. But it made for an interesting sort of, let's say, dialogue anyway. And in our own way, the 2 countries were sort of pursuing this shared interest in somewhat different ways, and I think learning from one another. Now, of course, India seems to be a bit on its own with the TikTok ban. Now, perhaps a change in structure might lead them to reconsider, if not only because it's now majority owned American, but because India's got to deal with its own supply chain vulnerabilities vis-a-vis China in a way that feels more, at least to me, exposed than it might have been. The circumstances haven't really changed, but certainly, I wouldn't say under the U.S. umbrella, but within the comforts, I guess, of a close strategic partnership and close consultations with the U.S. on China, and a sense of shared interest on China, you might be more comfortable pursuing a harder line than maybe India will be in the future. But I don't think any actions have been taken, at least since the meeting's intention.
Anyone else in the panel? Okay. Other questions? Shashank want to go up here.
Hi, Shashank Mathu with the Hindustan Times. Just two quick questions, more on the defense side. On the question, I think Mr. Rizuli was talking about the decline in Indian arms purchases from Russia. I was just curious, in your conversations with Indian bureaucrats and defense officials, is it pitched to the Americans as a conscious policy of us reducing reliance on Russian arms equipment? Because I just see from time to time, I'm a journalist, so in the popular media, there's sometimes approvingly India sites, for example, or commentators cite buying the S-400 missile defense system. There is often a serious conversation about buying Sukhoi 57 fighter jets, the next generation of fighter jets from the Russians. So I was just curious about when they say this to the Americans, do they say it as this is an intentional policy, or no, we will buy from the West and from the French and the Israelis if this is a good deal? Could I also ask, secondly, this is again, I'm sorry to ask, but popular discourse, because this is what I deal with day in and day out, which is this question of American reliability and trust, and how you dealt with those questions of, if we buy defense equipment from the Americans, there's this possibility of, quote unquote, a kill switch. And therefore, if, for example, with F-35s, we can't use American equipment because they won't let us fight the wars that we want to fight. This is a popular view that is often comes up in popular commentary about the India-US relationship. So if I could ask people who have experienced the defense relationship to answer those two questions.
I'll just answer really briefly the first, and then I'll leave it to my co-panelists on the second. The first one is the easy one, because the answer is no articulation of sorts. We would judge the results, but our Indian counterparts, in my experience, never articulated that intent explicitly.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, India is to their credit, it was very straightforward. We're going to buy the best deal, what we think is the best system for us from the best supplier, and I don't think they've ever said that Russia has been a bad partner. I do think that there's a strong feeling in India, in private, that they want the best technology, and what's gone in America's favor is that Russia's not going to be your best source for the best technology, especially when Russia is still going to be very busy rearming itself. So I think that's been the sort of the tone there. But we wouldn't, and I think we wouldn't expect it. We are looking at, we're on the upswing, they're on the downswing. Allies and partners are also on the upswing. It's a good direction of travel. The kill switch stuff and the historic mistrust. I mean, I think the historic mistrust when it comes to things like would we be sanctioned or would we feel some sort of pressure, I mean, I think is just based on realism, based on like look, America does do this when it has a lot of ability to do that kind of thing. But things like kill switches and stuff like that is sort of, in the realm of nonsense, right? That isn't a thing that that there's any evidence of in any scenario, right? And, if you look, I mean, until Israel got rid of all of them very recently, Iran was still flying old American fighter jets, or even earlier.
Well, Tom Cruise is flying them too. So.
So I don't see. I think there is a very, very lively conspiracy theory universe in India and in lots of other places, but that a lot of that stuff is imaginary.
Just on the Russia weapons platforms, I mean, I do think that we have to prepare that there will be sort of continued induction of some, like a narrow band of capabilities, right? Like I think that there's still going to be a lease of a nuclear submarine because no one else is going to provide it. I think that there's going to be follow-on production of BrahMos missiles, whether we want to call that a Russian or a joint venture system. But I do think that there's times when, like, you hear Indian, maybe former officials go on record and say explicitly why you transition from a Russian platform to a U.S. platform. The example I'll give you is Admiral Lanba, former naval chief, did an interview, I want to say in the spring, where he's talking about the induction of the P-8I in comparison to the Russian sort of maritime patrol aircraft, the Tu-142. Basically says like the P-8I in 15 years of operation has logged more hours than the Tu-142 in over 30 years, and it's because of sustainability and performance. And so I think those are the kinds of things where, like, you don't need to sort of go after Russian weapons because who is the leader in the regime or anything like that. It's just simply about a performance question. And I do think the Indians are sort of introspecting under the hood about what happened with the S-400 system, not just in sort of the India-Pakistan theater, but how it might fare in the India-China theater, how S-300s have fared sort of with Iran and Israel, or even the Russia-Ukraine context. Like, I think the Indians will start to look for alternative solutions.
I have a few minutes. I'm only going to take two questions. Patrick Roning up here, and then we will go with Seema Sirohi in the front row.
Yes, Patrick Cronin, Hudson Institute. When you think about the many reasons for defense technology cooperation between India and the United States, don't you see China still looming as the main impetus? When I think about the recent military parade and the kind of modernization that's underway, or Pakistan coming over to visit the J-10 factory, or think about the PLA Volt Typhoon, ongoing campaign, intruding into Indian systems, intruding into our systems, pre-positioning for military action potentially. Isn't that really a major impetus that is going to surface above this diplomacy, the current hiatus in our relations?
Can we also take the second question, and then I'll ask the panel to answer in one go.
Hi, Seema Sirohi, The Economic Times. I just wanted to ask you all, what is Trump's China policy from what you can understand? And because, a lot depends on what is articulated here in Washington for other countries to fashion their policies. Turns out there's some early reporting on the national security strategy that the focus will now be on the Western Hemisphere and the homeland, and no longer the Indo-Pacific to the same extent it was. And one small comment, the TikTok thing that you guys were discussing, seems the algorithm is going to still be owned by China.
I'd like all of you to answer with questions, but while you do that, I have think of your concluding remarks. So I'll start with Ingrid in reverse order. But I'd like you to sort of look at the China question and the China factor in this as also, the relationship for the last 35 years. There was a certain strategic imperative which drove it. It could be India's rise, it could be China's rise. Without that imperative, whether it's the China threat or the belief in India's rise, will that have an impact on the security aspect of the partnership? If China is no longer, there's no China factor, and there's no interest in India's rise as a military power in the region, will it have an impact on the India-US defense partnership? Ingrid.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine not considering the China factor. On the commercial side, there is a business case now beyond just the strategic relationship. There are companies that are making equipment in India that is for export, not just looking at an Indian customer. And they recognize, especially if we look at fields like AI, there are such natural synergies that exist that will continue. It's hard to imagine that not being the case. On the China factor, again, I think that just the Indo-Pacific policy, Indo-PACOM, I think our military recognizes that this is certainly a threat we need to prepare for. And the big change on the commercial side is that when we started all of this back in the early 2000s, interoperability was a bad word. Today, we work very closely with partners throughout the region, to include India, where our equipment, in fact, is interoperable now.
Yeah, so on the sort of general China question, and I agree with Patrick, it has been sort of a key driver of the US-India, the defense operational, the technology, the intelligence relationship, and I think it will continue to be. I mean, yes, I think that there are moments when you're going to see countries try to stabilize the ship with China, and that might be characterized as a rapprochement. You might get a trade deal here and there, but I still think the general expectation I have is over the average or long term, the relationship with China is going to regress to the mean, and that mean is adversarial, right? Because and it oftentimes has a lot to do with sort of China's own behavior. I mean, we had the Wuhan summit process and the Shanghai connection, and then in 2020, China is basically invading territory controlled by India, and the United States had a trade deal with China, and then by 2020, things had sort of hit an all-time low. So I think you can have moments of agreement and even sort of functional trade and economic exchange, but I think we are regressing to an adversarial relationship ultimately.
Vikram?
I think Patrick, your question, absolutely China will remain a factor. I think that one good way to look at it is just break it into a couple of sections. So 2005 to 2015 was the era of still trying to keep the responsible stakeholder hopes and dreams alive and keep the robust partnership, keep access to the Chinese market, keep cheap Chinese goods flowing to the United States. And we were still building this defense and strategic partnership with India. And both political parties were driving it forward, even though we had sort of a deal with China, right? And post Xi Jinping to now, you've seen this complete reversal, really, finally, so essentially a new consensus of China as the pacing threat and the sort of the adversarial nature of the relationship being the reality that we were trying to hide for the previous decade. And of course, U.S.-India ties have continued to deepen. So let's say we do get a deal with China. Clearly, the president wants an economic deal with China. That's I don't think any of us can make any predictions about what's going to happen. If an economic deal with China doesn't happen, that's going to amp up the strategic rivalry, and if it does happen, maybe that tamps it down to some degree. But I think it would feel a little bit more like pre-2015. You'd still probably be looking for these deeper relationships with other partners in the region, and keeping our alliances strong and building up the India relationship would be a part of that. Seema, maybe that answers a little bit of what I think the policy is, but I don't think it's anything more than anyone else sees. There's very much a concerted effort to keep talks going and extend deadlines and try to get an economic deal with China. I think that's above the security concerns, right? At least for the time being.
Anthony.
I agree with everything that was said, and as well as sort of, I guess the core of the questions. Maybe the only thing I would add is, undoubtedly, building a convergence of interests over China with India was absolutely an animating factor in the growth of the strategic partnership, and for about the amount of time that Vikram outlined, and in particular over the previous 4 years during the last administration coming out of Galwan and coming after 2020. And I think we will regress to the means, as Samir said, but I should emphasize, though, that China's not the only factor underpinning the U.S.-India strategic partnership as it was. China was definitely a background issue. I don't think we were really in the sort of, I think it was sort of Robert Kaplan articulation or others early on, thinking about India in that way vis-a-vis China. I don't think that's really where the Obama administration really was at the time. It's really kind of a modern manifestation to really be sort of kind of explicit about our shared interests on China. There's other factors. There's the people-to-people ties that I would say, in my experience, are foundational to the strategic partnership. Substantial cooperation around clean energy and India's energy transition, which is arguably the most consequential in the world after China, perhaps. Health and cooperation that goes back far longer than the Civil Nuclear Agreement, for example. Non-proliferation cooperation as well is a part of that. And other things that do feel like they're under strain, to say the least, right now. And so, we could end up in a situation in which our interests on China are very strong and well aligned, but the other parts are really kind of frayed and thin, and it would seem harder to me for the two countries to continue to build the kind of robust partnership that would position ourselves. Oh, and the supply chain diversification piece, which obviously, in a scenario in which your tariffs on India are nearly double what they are in China, that China plus one strategy just doesn't work. Now, we probably will get to a better place, knock on wood, but for now, we're not there. So I think you really do have to look at the whole picture. And I think any sort of, convergent or shared interest around our partnership, and we call it not an alliance, but an alignment on counter China, that's not the words, I don't think that's the right phrase, needs a lot more than just a strong defense partnership to be effective.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the panelists once again for taking out time, and all of you for attending today's conversation. Thank you.